The 14th Wildland Fire Safety Summit. My name is Ewan Ferguson. I'm a member of the Board of Directors of the International Association of Wildland Fire. I'm also the co-chair of the organising committee, and one of my duties is to be the session chair from now until lunch. I have a couple of announcements and comments first. We understand the seating difficulty in room 1, and we're endeavouring to get some additional seating for the keynote presentations for the rest of the day. So we ask you to bear with us. We've been oversubscribed, which is a good problem to have, but there is a limit on the seating. I also want to remind you that for the interpreting service, to listen in Spanish, you listen to channel 1. If to listen in English, you listen to channel 2. In the main presentation, there was a problem with the translation from Spanish to English, and we apologise that occurred. The next series of presentations are around the theme of decision making. These presentations, we asked the presenter to speak for around 15 minutes, which should allow for 5 minutes or so of questions and answers. So if you have questions, feel free to hold on to those until after. The speaker we're just about to hear from is Rebekah Fox. Rebekah is the associate professor, or an associate professor with Texas State University. And she'll be speaking on a title, When Simplified Communication Doesn't Match Lived Complexity, Best Practices and Creative Workarounds. Please join with me to welcome Rebekah Fox.
Thank you and welcome. I want to begin by giving you a little bit of background on the presentation that I'm going to give today and a little bit of the journey of the paper that I'll be discussing. This project began in 2014 as a grant-funded project with the Joint Fire Science Program. And that actual grant was called Risk Perception, Sense-Making, and Resilient Performance, the Sounds of Wildland Firefighting in Action. We're now finished with the grant funding process, and we're writing up our results. Through this process, we have presented parts of what we have learned throughout our 3 years of doing this work at different International Association of Wildland Fire conferences, and along with National Communication Association conferences. So we're contributing in both of those conversations. Over the course of the time that we've been asking questions about risk perception, and the role that communication plays in those activities, we have spent quite a bit of time in the field. We have conducted over 60 hours of qualitative interviews, roughly the same amount, 60 hours of participant observation in the S-130 and 190 classes, with 2 of our team members going on to get red cards, including myself. We participated in an observation at NAFRI for a Type 1 crew. We've done extensive textual analysis on training materials, the IRPG, and any other kinds of materials that we could find in local forests and local regions and those kinds of things. And we also spent about 60 hours during field observations during an actual incident in Salmon, Idaho. What we have found is that we, as a forest or as a system, are sending mixed messages about what communication is. Primarily, we're sending mixed messages about 2 different things. One, our current training presents communication as mainly an equipment issue, and it also presents communication, or the skill of communication, as something that's fairly easy to do that can be picked up on the job. Yet, our after-incident reviews, our facilitating learning analyses, our rapid lessons shared, and our after-action reviews all reflect much more complexity. For instance, the Arnell Hill Serious Fire Accident Investigation Report lists 2 different communication failures as primarily contributing to the loss. It says, radio communications were challenging throughout the incident. Some radios were not programmed with appropriate tone guards. Crews identified the problem, engaged in troubleshooting, and developed workarounds so they could communicate using their radios. Radio traffic was heavy during critical times in the fire. It went on to say, and I want you to pick up on the difference in the type of communication we're discussing here. Although much communication occurred among crews throughout the day, few people understood Granite Mountain's intentions, movements, and location once they left the black. The team believes this is due to brief, informal, and vague radio transmissions and talk-arounds that can occur during wildland fire communications. This report actually does discern between communications with an S, right here, and communication. This side with an S, we mean this has to do with equipment, maybe not being able to key the actual radio. This has to do with framing of messages, understanding intent, understanding motivation. And I've read hundreds of these reports that conflate the two. We say things like, oh, there was a communication failure, and we all shake our heads like we are all in agreement about what that means, yet we do not have a clear understanding of those implications. So there has been other people who have dedicated time to understanding these issues. Primarily, these examples here, I don't expect for you to actually read through all of them. What I list them here is to show you that people are interested in fire communication, and we are paying attention to it more and more. The issue is that right now, we are spending a lot of time talking to people about how to speak properly and how to actually negotiate certain kinds of things. These relational and cultural articles are getting closer to understanding the process that we are interested in understanding too. There have also been articles written about specifically radio communication. Radio communication, language choices, tone, etiquette, censoring negative emotions, and these kinds of things. So we're getting closer to having an understanding of how radio communication should function and how we can get better at doing it. This piece by Taylor and Alexander does a good job of trying to establish how it is that people are dealing with complex situations instead of simplifying our notion of communication. Particularly, my team has studied the language of high reliability organizing, so how it is that organizations who under very trying situations are able to function with very few accidents. Everyone's familiar with HRO at this point. This piece that we wrote that is cited here, Thomas, Fox, and Miller from 2015, we specifically looked at how it is that people sound, the kinds of language resources they use when they're practicing high reliability organizing. So the 5 elements of high reliability organizing, what does it sound like when people do that? We understand it from a cognitive position, more of a psychological position, but not as much from a communication position. So that was the focus in that piece. And right now, and for about 5 more days, that piece will be featured on the U.S. Fire Administration website. So I invite you to look at that for free for a couple more days. That piece looked at the text. What are we saying in these situations? The piece I'll be discussing today looks at the context. If we are to understand how communication is made manifest, how people make choices about the language they're going to use, we must understand the communication complexity of the environment. And that's why we focused on context. What we have found through these interviews and through our analysis of all the textual items that we have collected is that we have oversimplifications that do not match our lived complexities. Now, it sounds like we would want to simplify things. We would want simplifications and we would want to avoid complexities. But that's not the case when what we're doing is simplifying and presenting communication as if it is going to be easy and as if it is something that is very natural and that we can all do it. So we've organized our findings into 3 categories, and I'm going to spend the next few minutes just discussing a couple of examples of the different things that we have found in these areas. Communication training and how we have simplified the presentation of communication in those situations. The nature of communication, which is made manifest in both training and within cultural situations. And our use of communication technologies. So the first of these is our communication training. The simplification, these will be organized based on the simplification and then the complexity below it. So the simplification is we present communication, radio communication, that it can be taught adequately in formal training that is short, that's very lecture-based, technologically focused, and has very little practical exercises. And the S13190 class is a very short section of those training materials, and it relies on very outdated communication models as far as the communication discipline is concerned. We need more experiential learning opportunities in the classroom. We have a lack of practice opportunities outside of actual fires. So our interviewees reported that they needed to have chances to practice good communication on the radio, but not when they're in an actual fire situation. And we also recognize that there's not enough recognition about the anxiety that rookies and new people feel whenever they're communicating on the radio. One air attack boss that we interviewed mentioned one of his creative workarounds, and I know that that's what probably many of you are here to learn about today. I will say some of those workarounds as I go through the presentation and then give a few at the end. This air attack boss mentioned, I did this last year at an air attack refresher, and it was really cool to see the response. I asked folks to close their eyes, turn the lights off in the room, and said, I want you to put yourself in the cockpit of the airplane. And now I want you to picture, you look out the right wing of the airplane and your engine's on fire. Think about what you would say. Think about what you would tell dispatch. Think about what you would say to ground, to the copter, what you would say to the pilot. Walk them through the process. Okay, cool. 2 people volunteered. They raised their hand, and I say it out loud. And it was amazing. 2 really experienced air attacks sounded completely frustrated and flustered trying to get the words out. I told them they must rehearse what they want to say in their heads and say the words out loud. If you don't say things out loud, it is unclear to you, and you need to make sense to other people. It's one of those things that open their eyes, and they not only recognize the need to practice, but they recognize the need to say things out loud. He went on to say, it's not something you can do once in your career and call it good. You must continuously practice. He also relayed a story to us about taking recordings that would happen during the day and taking them to his hotel in the evenings and playing them back so that he could hear the instances when he thought that he was less clear than he could have been. So an interesting and creative way to practice. This is an example of the same kind of issue. Once you become a good communicator, you'll remain a good communicator. Everyone recognizes the need to have refreshers and to continuously improve upon communication, but that doesn't mean just returning to the same kinds of scenarios. Increasing the complexity and the novelty of the different kinds of variables into those training scenarios is important to becoming a competent communicator. The second of the categories is the nature of communication. When we are discussing the nature of communication, we mean what is at its essence and how is it being communicated through our thoughts and our actions. And one of the issues that we recognize is people believe that we naturally adapt to the needs of the listener, but that's not a very easy thing to do, and that's not something that we train for. We train how do you key the mic, how do you program certain kinds of things, but we don't train for things like how can you be clear in your messaging. To be quick here, I want to just point out that this, the second thing here, there's little to no emphasis on framing or organizing messages. The fast, easy way to fix this is to teach people how to preview messages and how to transition between messages. Saying something simple like, I will be giving you this message in 3 parts, and then when you're moving from the first part to the second part, to provide a transition. I will now be moving from the first to the second part of this message. That's not something that we train for. It's an easy thing that we can integrate into our training, but at this time we don't have that in the system. We also, our interviewees recognize the need for others to learn different positions within the ICS system. So whenever people are trying to manage things in the field, if they've not spent time in dispatch, they don't fully understand the complexity of the dispatch center. So having people witness the different kinds of positions so that they have a better understanding of the demands and the constraints of those other positions is important. And this is also something that we can do to increase training competencies. As far as communication technologies are concerned, we have a simplification. We think that our radios are going to work and that they are in place and that the proper use of channels and frequencies is understood. That's not always the case. There are holes in coverage. We all recognize those kinds of problems. And there is definitely channel and frequency confusion. I'm sure that there are several of you in this room who have experienced those kinds of things. When people are making decisions on a tactical channel when it shouldn't be. Whenever you are witnessing someone who is talking over somebody else and it is absolutely inappropriate kinds of content. So these are the kinds of things that that is important to recognize that we need to improve upon with our communication technology. The last of these examples has to do with the radio being the trusted best method for communicating. One of the things that continuously was brought up to us during our interviews is the presence and the use of cell phones and how that is in violation of certain kinds of policies. Some decisions require more communication, and by more, I mean sometimes it's inappropriate to discuss certain things on the radio. Sometimes it would embarrass people to discuss some things on the radio. Sometimes it takes too much time. So people are using their cell phones to provide more modes of communication, to be able to share maps and pictures and those kinds of things. So in sum, we've recognized that there is a need for experiential learning in the basic training courses to provide practice, not only to provide practice, but to emphasize that communication is important. If we continue to say it's something you can pick up later, that doesn't encourage people to take it seriously and to recognize that it's something that they need to practice. We would recommend using radios. When I went through guard school, we didn't have a radio in our hand. We saw a radio, but we didn't have it in our hand. We weren't invited to try and use it. We also would recognize the importance of using dispatch recordings as learning tools and to teach students the appropriate use of cell phones. If our policy is actually not to use personal cell phones, yet we know that people are using them and that they can get more efficient work done on them, we need to teach people the appropriate use of these kinds of radios. Sometimes it is appropriate, sometimes it is not. But right now, what we're doing is we're saying we do not do that, but that's not really what's happening on the ground. So our simplified notion of how we communicate about it is not matching up to our lived complexity. We also recognize the need for learning assessment beyond multiple choice tests in those training classes. We need to recognize if people are actually getting something out of that, and that would also decrease their anxiety. And during these trainings, we need to encourage ownership of the material that's being taught. These two things I hear in trainings, different kinds of trainings, and I bet you have too. Bear with me, I'm not a teacher. Well, if you're standing in front of people, you are the teacher, and we need to recognize that the way you frame things and the importance of things is going to make a difference. And then the last one here, I'm sorry, this will be death by PowerPoint. This just lets people off the hook so that they don't have to listen or they don't have to think that what you're going to tell them is important. The last thing I want to mention is that the way that we become better and more competent communicators is because we have chances to practice and because we're listening to other efficient, good, competent communicators. At the end of one of the trainings that I attended, there was a survey given, and it said, "Did your instructor tell too many stories?" This shows the notion that we subjugate the idea of storytelling, yet some of the most rich information that we can learn and some of the best modeling that we can gain comes from the stories that other people share with us. And I encourage you to introduce those into your trainings and also to be mindful of the stories that you hear. Thank you. Oh, let's see.
Thank you, Rebekah. The next speaker hasn't shown up, so we have some time for questions and answers from the audience. Are there any questions people would like to ask Rebekah about her intriguing presentation? I'll ask one.
Okay.
Your finishing comments about storytelling, which brings in the ability to picture in your mind what it is you're trying to say. Do you think that the psychology of communication is going to be dealt with more and more in firefighter training in the future?
I hope that it will. I think that our interviewees responded that some of the most difficult things to communicate on the radio is what you're seeing. So how to paint a picture for the person who is co-located is one of the skills that we all know is difficult to do, yet we very infrequently train for that kind of thing. I want to also mention that one of my teammates, Elena Gabor, has a poster in the poster session that will be discussing how to communicate on the radio specifically with emotion and the visual aspects. Sometimes people on the radio say things like, I felt like I had on a mask. But you hear how they're mixing the metaphor between talking and seeing something? This is important because we are relying on people to be able to articulate what it is that they see, but we're not training them to be able to do that.
Thank you. Any questions on this field for Rebekah? You've done an excellent job.
Oh, thank you.
Could I once again ask you to join in thanking Rebekah? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.